Dear subscribers, viewers, and the students, welcome to the IAS Mentor. This would be our lecture number 7 in the series Indian Polity, where the objective is to give a broader idea on the subject Indian polity, and thereby we'll also cover the Indian Constitution and some of the important books related to the civil service preparation will also be covered, which includes books like LAXMIKANTH, D.D BASU. And this series will be useful to all the students preparing for UPSC and also for other competitive examination. So with that, we'll just get into our lecture number 7. As I already told in the last lecture, this lecture will do some practice question. So the objective is not only that we'll learn, we'll also try to apply whatever you have learned over the period of time. So after covering certain important topics, I'll also have some practice lectures where we'll basically try to solve some questions so that the gap in the knowledge will also get cleared. So that's the objective of this practice. So today we'll get into the practice questions, but before I get into the practice question, what are the topics we have covered? We try to understand as to what is a constitution, and then we understood as to the constitution was drafted by the Constituent Assembly, what was the history and design behind the Constituent Assembly, and what was the design of the Constituent Assembly basically. And then we also understood the topic of what is called as historical background. And in the historical background, we have understood as to what happened during the company rule, and then subsequently what happened to the crown rule, and then the major development that has happened over a period of time, and then ultimately India became independent by the Indian Independence Act 1947. So we have understood all these things earlier. So from these topics, now let us try to solve the questions. Okay, and in the process we'll also try to revise whatever you have learned. So come to question number 1. Which of the following is not a feature of Indian Constitution? So this is something that I explained when I took up the topic, what is a constitution. So let us try to understand which of the following is not a feature of Indian Constitution. First, a written constitution, and I have very clearly said that the Constitution of India is a written constitution. A written constitution is something which is codified into a single document, or sometimes maybe more than one document also, but only that is considered to be the constitution, and that is only what constitutes the fundamental law of the land. So definitely that is a feature of Indian Constitution. An organic document, is the Indian Constitution an organic document? Of course, it is an organic document. What is an organic document? A document that can go for a change. The Constitution that can be amended. So if you look into the Constitution of India, there is a specific article in the Constitution that gives the power to the Parliament to amend the Constitution. If you know which article gives this power to the Parliament, you can put that article number in the comment box, which I already discussed, but anyways, as we'll proceed, we'll discuss about this also. So definitely these two things are part of or feature of the Indian Constitution. Now the third thing is the Indian Constitution flexible constitution, which means how easy or how difficult it is to amend the Constitution. Amendment means making changes to the Constitution. To say that the Indian Constitution is a flexible constitution is not true. Indian Constitution is in fact a blend of rigidity as well as flexibility. That means some of the provisions are easy to amend or to make changes, but most of the provisions are difficult, and hence this is not a feature of Indian Constitution. And that is the reason why in the history of last I would say around 75 years since 1950, we have amended the Constitution of India only 106 times. And in fact, the American Constitution is even more rigid than the Indian Constitution. And in their constitutional history, they have very less number of constitutional amendments. So there's definitely this is not a feature. So with that, we'll try to answer. It is asking which of the following is not a feature of the Indian Constitution. So the right answer would be option C, that the Constitution of India is a flexible in nature. So that is definitely not the right answer. Come to question number 2. The original Constitution at the commencement contained what is? The original Constitution at the commencement of the Constitution contained. So at the commencement, what were the things that is there in the Indian Constitution? That is basically this particular question. So we have categorically read this also when we are discussing what is a constitution, and when we are discussing the Constituent Assembly also, that the original constitution which was drafted by the Constituent Assembly, adopted by them on 26 November 1949 and subsequently came into force on 26 January 1950, had 395 articles, 22 parts and 8 schedules. So what would be the answer? It is option D. D is the right answer. 395 articles, 22 parts and 8 schedules. And I also discussed, as of today, after 106 amendments have happened to the constitution, and the latest amendment happened in 2024. So now how many articles, how many parts and how many schedules are there in the constitution, which also I have already discussed. You can just recollect as to what it is, and if you know the answer, you can also put that in the comment box. Come to question number 3. Which of the following is based on which the seats were allocated to the provinces and princely states in the Constituent Assembly? So this question is basically from the design of the Constituent Assembly. We have already clearly seen as to what is the design of the Constituent Assembly. In fact, the Constituent Assembly in India was established based on the Cabinet Mission Plan, and by June 1946 the design was ready and the Constituent Assembly was also established. So basically, as per this particular design, the Constituent Assembly is to have membership from both what is called as the princely states as well as from the provinces, and to some extent from the commissioner provinces as well. But whereas in case of, we have already read, in case of the princely states and the commissioner provinces, it was by way of nomination, and in case of British provinces, it was by indirect election. And what is the basis on which this representation is to happen in the Constituent Assembly? It was to be on the basis of population. That is the design. And what approximately will be the population? The population is usually on the basis of 1:1 million. That means for every 1 million population, 1 seats were given to the provinces or the princely states. So what is the answer here? It is basically on the basis of population. And we know that overall there were 389 members as a part of the Constituent Assembly in the original design, of which 292 were given to the British provinces, 93 to the princely states, and then you had another 4 seats which were given to what is called as the commissioner provinces. So the right answer in this particular case is option C, that is population. Come to question number 4. Which of the following act laid down the foundation for centralized administration in India during the company rule? So here the question is, which of the following laid down the foundation for centralized administration in India during the company rule? Now, when you talk of the company rule is from 1773 till 1857. So in this time, which laid down the foundation? In fact, the entire period was the era of centralization. And then when the crown has taken up the administration, gradually they are moving towards what is called as decentralization. So when you say the company rule basically believed in the idea of what is called as centralization. And the centralization began with what is called as a Regulating Act of 1773. In fact, that was the first act that was passed to regulate the affairs of the company during the company rule. And the first act laid down the foundation for what is called as the centralized administration during the company rule, which was basically done by designating the governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. So that is what is the foundation. So the right answer here is the Regulating Act of 1773. In fact, what was initiated in Regulating Act of 1773 that reached its pinnacle height, the highest point, through the Charter Act of 1833. In fact, it is the Charter Act of 1833 which further made the centralization process even more. And thereby they designated the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India. So don't get confused between the Regulating Act of 1773 and 1833. So the centralization was at its peak by the Charter Act of 1833. But which act laid down the foundation for centralized administration in India? It was the Regulating Act of 1773. Okay. So with that, we'll just move to the next question. Which of the following act has not extended the right of East India Company to administer the territory of British India for a fixed term? And this also we have learned. During the company rule, the company is merely what? The company is merely the representative of the crown to administer British India. And by various charter act after charter act, the right was given to the company to carry out the administration in British India for few more years. And we have seen a lot of charter acts which happened during what is called as the company rule, starting from the Charter Act of 1793, Charter Act of 1813, 1833, 1853. Almost all these charter acts has extended the time for which the company can rule India by 20 years. But however, one charter act did not provide for any fixed timeline for the Britishers to rule India, and that charter act for the company to rule India, British India, and that charter act is nothing but the Charter Act of 1853. So if you have listened to our lecture properly, you will also understand that the Charter Act of 1853 gave the permission to the East India Company to carry out the administration, but without giving a fixed timeline. And then subsequently in 1857, the revolt of 1857 happened, and then the Government of India Act 1858 was passed, and the British Crown has directly taken up the administration. So the right answer is option D. Come to the next question. The dual system of government was introduced in India during the company rule by. So when was this dual system of administration was introduced? But before I go into the dual system of administration, the question is, when was the dual system of administration was introduced? During the company rule. So it was during the company era, you will have to understand. So what is basically this dual role? And in fact, the dual role is nothing but that in the company there are two kinds of authorities. One is the court of directors, and another is the board of control. The court of directors would direct the governor general and his council to carry out what is called as a commercial activities of the company, whereas the board of control would direct the governor general and his council governor general and his council to carry out what is called as the political administration of India. So this system came to be what is called as the court of directors. Came to be what is called as the dual system of government. So we have also categorically learned the court of directors are nothing but the major stakeholders of the company. So they were really interested in what is called as a commercial activities. But what about the board of control? The board of control was headed by a cabinet minister in the British government. And then some members of parliament in the British government were also part of the board of control. And this board of control would direct the governor general and his council to carry out the political administration in India. And in fact, this dual system was brought in by the Pitt's India Act. Pitt's, the youngest prime minister of UK at that point of time, he wanted to bring in this particular reform. And in fact, his intention of bringing this particular reform is that he thought that this would enhance the efficiency with which the company will function. So the answer here is the Pitt's India Act of 1784. All right. Come to next question. Which of the following act ended the function of the company as a commercial body and made it purely an administrative body? Now try to understand, starting 1773, the Regulating Act of 1773, the company had two functions. One is basically it was carrying out its commercial activities, the business activities as well. And apart from that, it was also taking care of what is called as the political administration in India, which means it will collect taxes, it will administer the other, it will administer justice, it will control the army. So everything was done by the East India Company. So this continued, but now the question is asking, so which act ended the commercial functions of the East India Company? So specifically the answer is it was a Charter Act of 1833. So Charter Act of 1833 put an end to the company to carry forward what is called as its commercial functions. So from 1833, the East India Company was merely what? The East India Company was merely an administrative body. It was not a commercial body anymore. But even before this Charter Act of 1833, certain set of reforms was brought in by the Charter Act of 1813. In the Charter Act of 1813 itself, it made sure that the company would not have monopoly over the trade in India, and the monopoly rights was taken away except for trade with tea and trade with China, all the other trading rights were taken away. But however, in 1833, the company was made purely as what is called as an administrative body. So the answer here is, it is the Charter Act of 1833. And Charter Act of 1833 is significant for a number of reasons. And it is also the Charter Act of 1833 which is the point where the zenith or the pinnacle of centralization has happened during the company rule. And it is the Charter Act of 1833 which designated the Governor General of Bengal as the Governor General of India. And Lord William Bentinck was such first Governor General of India. So all these things may be asked in the prelims examination. Which of the following act transferred the authority to rule British India from the East India Company to the British Crown directly? So the entire period of the company rule, that is from 1773 to 1857, it was an era of what is called as a company rule. But then subsequently, after the company rule was over, the British Crown directly took up the administration. And what is the law that they passed to take up this administration directly is the Government of India Act 1858. It is the Government of India Act 1858 by which they have directly taken up the administration. They have directly taken up the administration, and for which they have established certain authorities. And who is supposed to carry out the administration of British India on behalf of the British Crown directly? It is none other than the Secretary of State. So Secretary of State is a minister in the British cabinet who would sit in England and direct the administration in India. But however, I said that there should be someone who is locally present in India, and that authority is nothing but the Viceroy. So the Secretary of State would directly contact or connect with the Viceroy, and the Viceroy on behalf of the Secretary of State would carry out the administration. So the answer for this particular question is the Government of India Act 1858. Come to the next question. Which of the following acts introduced the portfolio system in India, and who introduced it? That's another question. So which of the following acts introduced the portfolio system in India, and who introduced it? So which act introduced the portfolio system? The act that introduced the portfolio system in India is the Indian Councils Act of 1861, and it is this particular act which gave what is called as the statutory recognition to the portfolio system in India. And who was the Viceroy of India at that point of time when this portfolio system was introduced? It is none other than Lord Canning. So the right answer is Indian Councils Act, and the Viceroy is Lord Canning. So we already learned as to what is portfolio system. So just before we move to the next question, portfolio system is basically allocating certain department or ministry to specific members in the Executive Council. Earlier, before the portfolio system, the council completely looked after all the matters of administration. So everybody were responsible for everything. And there the problem is, it would be very difficult to fix the accountability. And hence Lord Canning thought that we'll have to bring in what is called as a portfolio system. So suppose if 5 members are there in the council, every person in the council, the Governor General Council or the Viceroy Council, would be responsible for a specific subject matter. Say for example, today the Home Minister is responsible for the Home Affairs, the Defence Minister is responsible for the Defence of India, the Finance Minister is responsible for managing the finances of our country, the Education Minister is responsible for managing the education in our country. So this is basically what is called as the portfolio system, which we have carried forward even after the Britishers have left India. But when that was first time introduced, it was introduced in as per the Indian Council Act 1861, and it was introduced by Lord Canning. Come to the next question. Which act provided for the appointment of an Indian into the Viceroy Executive Council for the first time? Very, very important. We have seen that the major development, one of the major development that has happened during the Crown rule is the Councils Act. And if you see the Councils Act, there were 3 major Councils Act. One is the Indian Council Act of 1861, and then we had the Indian Council Act of 1892, and then we had the Indian Council Act of 1909. Now, while all these Councils Act were trying to bring in major changes in the Legislative Council and also in the Executive Council, but for the first time an Indian was allowed to be part of the Executive Council is in the Indian Council Act 1909. And who was the first such Indian who was part of it? It is Mr. Satyendra Prasad Sinha, and who was part of the Executive Council, a first Indian to be part of it. And can you recollect and tell me which portfolio was he assigned as a part of the council? And if you know the answer, you can put it in the comment box. Okay. So the answer here is the Indian Council Act 1909. All right. We'll just move forward to the next system. Come to question number 11. The system of separate electorate was introduced for the first time by which of the following? First, we'll have to understand, even before we go into as to the separate before which introduced it. Now, what is the system of separate electorate? And if you can recollect the system of separate electorate. Now, separate electorate is a concept wherein people from a specific community, only they will be allowed to vote to elect their representatives. So, this is part of the Britishers' divide and rule policy in India at that point of time. So, when this system of separate electorate was introduced, the system of separate electorate was introduced by the Morley-Minto reforms in 1909, or which is also called as the Indian Council Act of 1909, and thereby Lord Minto became the father of communal electorate in our country. Okay, so the answer is option B in this particular case. Come to question number 12. Which of the following is true regarding the Indian Councils Act 1909? So, what are the provisions of the Indian Council Act 1909? Statement 1. The Act for the first time provided for the appointment of an Indian member in the Viceroy Executive Council. So, just now we have discussed, yes. For the first time, the Act allowed an Indian to be part of the Viceroy Executive Council, and first such member is Mr. Satyendra Prasad Sinha. So, this statement is definitely true. The Act allowed for the non-official majority in the legislative councils of both central as well as the provincial legislature. Now, while all the councils act, right from the Council Act of 1861, the Council Act of 1892, and then the Council Act of 1909, in all these cases, if you see that there was an expansion of council, legislative council especially, and then they also allowed the more Indian representation in these councils. And over a period of time, the Indian representation started expanding. But if you see the 1909 Act, while in the provincial legislature, the non-official members were more. But whereas in the central legislature, still who had the majority, it is the official members. And who is an official and a non-official member? I also explained this. An official member is someone who is part of the government, and non-official is someone who is outside the government. So the Act allowed the non-official majority in the legislative councils at the center and the state. So this is definitely wrong. So where there were official majority, in center still there was official majority. Only in the provinces there was non-official majority. Statement number 3. The members of the legislative council were allowed to ask supplementary questions. So over a period of time, the legislative council became more representative and little bit more democratic as it progressed. So by the time the Indian Council Act 1909, the members in the council were allowed to ask supplementary questions. They were allowed to discuss budget. They are allowed to ask questions of urgent matter importance, and as a follow-up, they can also ask supplementary questions. So this is also true. Choose the correct answer from the codes given below. So the right answer would be, if you eliminate option 2, which is not the right thing, so the answer would be option C, that is 1 and 3 only. That's the right answer. Come to the next question. The system of diarchy was introduced in the British India by. So what is the system of diarchy? So when this was introduced, if you can just think about this, you will understand that the system of diarchy was introduced in India by the Government of India Act 1919. And we have elaborately read about this system of diarchy. What is the system of diarchy? System of diarchy is a concept where whatever subjects that was given to the provinces, and these subjects were further divided into 2 lists. And what are the list as to how they were divided? They were divided into what is called as transferred list and reserved list. And the transferred list are those subjects which are transferred to the responsible Indian minister, and he will carry out the administration. But whereas the reserved subjects or the reserved lists are those subjects where the governor in the provinces will carry out administration in these areas, because for them the reserved subjects or list are very important and not the transferred list. But however, this system was first introduced by the Government of India 1919. But we said that ultimately the system was a failure. So in the Government of India 1935, this diarchy was done away with. Okay. So just try to recollect whatever you have learned. Come to the next thing, that is question number 14. The concept of indirect election brought in for the first time during the British rule, and in which act? I have already said for the first time there was some element of indirect election was in the Indian Council Act 1892, although the expression indirect election was not directly mentioned in that particular act. So it continued to be a system of nomination, but more or less it was like a system of indirect election. So the principle in essence of indirect election was brought in by the Indian Council Act 1892, which also continued in 1909. So till 1909 it was only a system of indirect election. So try to remember this, very very important. So such factual questions will be asked or may be asked in the prelims examination, and most of the times it can be asked in the state PCS as well. Okay, so come to the next thing. Consider the following. Statement 1, abolition of diarchy in provinces. So that is the first statement. Statement 2, bicameralism in provincial legislature. Now let us read the question. Which of the following is true regarding the Government of India Act 1935? Which means the question is asking of these two statements, which are all the features of the Government of India Act 1935. So let us try to understand the feature of the Government of India Act 1935. One is abolition of diarchy in provinces. I said the system of diarchy was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919, but then the system of diarchy was a failure, and hence later it was done away with by the Government of India Act 1935 based on the recommendation of the Simon Commission. We have also learned that. Statement 2, bicameralism in provincial legislature. This is completely true. The bicameralism means having two houses in the legislative body. The bicameralism was introduced in the central legislature by the Government of India Act 1919. But however, this was further extended to the provinces by what is called as the Government of India Act 1935. So this is definitely true. Which of the following is true regarding the Government of India Act 1935? So statement 1 is wrong, statement 2 is right. So the right answer is option B. Option B is the correct answer. Which of the following is not true regarding the provisions of the Indian Independence Act? So come to question number 16. Which of the following is not true regarding the Indian Independence Act? We know that the objective of the Indian Independence Act is to give independence to India and to empower India to be independent, to empower the Constituent Assembly to draft its own constitution. So it basically had some of the provisions. So let us try to understand. Creation of two dominion states. Yes, the Indian Independence Act in fact has created two dominions. One is India, another is Pakistan. The princely states had an option to join either India or Pakistan, but can't remain independent. So if you look into the provisions of the Indian Independence Act, it said that the princely states at that point of time, they were free either to join India or to join Pakistan, and if they want to remain independent, not joining any of these dominions, they are also free to do that. So to that extent, this particular statement is wrong. Made the Constituent Assembly of India a sovereign body. Did the Indian Independence Act make the Constituent Assembly of India a sovereign body? Completely right statement. The Constituent Assembly of India become a sovereign body to draft the constitution as it wishes, based on which India can be governed in the future. So this is definitely true. So it is saying which of the following is not true regarding the provisions of the Indian Independence Act. So which is not true? Statement B is not true. So the right answer is option B. Alright. So with that we'll move to the next question, that is question number 17. Which of the following, this should be a small correction, which of the following act introduced the system of direct elections for the first time in British India? Now we have categorically studied the system of indirect election was brought in Indian Council Act 1892, and that continued till 1909. So if that continued till 1909, what is the next major development that has happened is the Indian Government of India Act 1919. So for the first time when the system of direct election was introduced, it was introduced by the Government of India Act 1919. All these questions are very, very important. Although they introduced a system of direct election, but it was not on the basis of adult suffrage. It was not on the basis of universal adult suffrage. That means it did not give voting rights to all the people, but it was based on the principle of what is called as limited adult suffrage. Only few people were given the right to vote depending upon their status in the society, the property that they possess, their educational status. All these parameters were taken into account, but however, the system was a direct election. Please come to question number 18. Which of the following act was passed to bring more efficiency in administration of the East India Company during their of company rule? So, during the company rule, now go back to company rule. So, when you go back to company rule, it has to be somewhere between 1773 to 1857. So, which was directed at bringing in more efficiency in the company administration is nothing but to bring in what is called as a dual system of administration. And that is nothing but it was brought in by the Pitt's India Act, where the Pitt's India Act introduced two type of control within the company. One is board of control and other is what is called as the court of directors. The court of directors would look at the commercial functions, whereas the board of control would look into what is called as the political functions. So thereby the system would be more efficient. That's the idea. So the answer here is what is called as the Pitt's India Act of 1784. Please come to question number 19. Consider the following statements. Statement 1. First step taken by the British Parliament to regulate the affairs of East India Company. This is statement 1. Statement 2. The Governor of Bengal was designated as the Governor General of Bengal. Which of the statements given above is true regarding the Regulating Act of 1773? In reference to the Regulating Act of 1773, which of the statement is true? In fact, the Regulating Act of 1773 is the first step that was taken by the British Parliament to regulate the affairs of East India Company. Definitely true. And it is also this particular act which designated the Governor of Bengal as the Governor General of Bengal. That is also true. But don't confuse this with when the Governor General of Bengal was designated as the Governor General of India. That happened in 1833. So both the statements are true. Which of the statements given above is true? So both 1 and 2. The answer is option C. Come to the last question for today's discussion. Look into question number 20. Which of the following is the features of the Government of India Act 1919? Statement 1. Bicameralism in the central legislature? Yes. For the first time, bicameralism was introduced by the Government of India Act 1919, but only in the central legislature. It was only the Government of India Act 1935 which provided for bicameralism in the provincial legislature as well. Direct elections with limited franchise? Yes. It brought in a system of direct election with limited franchise, which also we have seen. 3. Extension of principle of communal electorate? Yes. In fact, the communal electorate was introduced by the Indian Councils Act of 1909. But however, the principle of communal electorate was further extended by the Government of India Act 1919, which were further extended by the Government of India Act 1935. So definitely it is all true. Which of choose the correct answer from the codes given below? So all of the above. All the answers are the right answers. So I am sure that the questions that you have discussed would have definitely helped you in revising these things. In fact, during the examination, what is important is not just the preparation, but you should also do a lot of revision. That will help you to apply whatever you have learned and also to evaluate whether you have understood properly or not. That's why we have done this particular revision. So as we'll proceed, we'll cover a lot of important topics and then we'll also do some revision. So we are almost done with the basics of things. So as we'll proceed, now we'll try to understand the important concepts in the Constitution. So you can continue watching this particular lecture and I'm very sure it will be very useful to all of you. And if you have any of your friends or family members preparing for UPSC examination or any of the other competitive examination, you can refer this channel to them as well. I'm quite sure it will be extremely useful to all the students. Thank you very much. All the very best.